I'm Tom, I'm invested in the Cosmere, and today we're creating a Shadesmar map to be used in the Cosmere RPG, either as an endeavor or a combat encounter, pretty much any type of scene you're trying to run in Shadesmar. We're going to make a generic encounter map that you can use using the software Inkarnate. Now, we're using this specific software because it's something I've used for a very long time. I do all of my battle maps in Incarnate. I have the pro account, sort of the commercial license. This wasn't paid by them in any way, not sponsored. I just love using the tool, but there are so many other tools like it. You can use the free version of Incarnate. You can use any of the other graphic design tools that are out there to make something similar to this. I just like it because out of the box, it's a pretty complete solution for making these types of maps. Before we get in and create our map, I want to take kind of a step back and go through my map making process. When I'm thinking about creating a map for a combat encounter, I usually try to make it pretty interesting. I don't like just sort of a flat plane with maybe a couple of pictures on it. I want some dynamic environment. I want some sort of obstacles that folks have to work around, whether that's, a river running through the map or some challenging geography. And I think Shadesmar is a really interesting place to try to set a combat encounter in because it's so foreign from Roshar, which is already a pretty foreign place from the real world. And for inspiration, I'm using sort of the cover of Rhythm of War, the artwork by Michael Whalen. Just iconic scene from Rhythm of War and really the books in general. Really the striking imagery of just how foreign Shadesmar is. You've got the beat ocean, you've got the crazy ecology of the different trees and the crystalline structures. You can see sort of the jaggedness of the obsidian that makes up the ground. And there's just a lot to work with here when making a battle map that will be fun and interesting for people playing the Cosmere RPG. So we'll get into Inkarnate. This isn't going to be a walkthrough of Inkarnate. It's more kind of my process as I go to make a battle map. I will highlight some aspects of the tool that are helpful. If you wanted to check the software out and give it a try for yourself, you could kind of use this as a guide to get started and just certain things you're going to want to know and be thinking about as you're building a map. But the sort of general practices here are going to work in any kind of software that you're trying to use. And in terms of using the maps, they'll of course be free on investedinthecosmere.com. You'll be able to download them for yourself. I'll also give a grid and a non-grid version and talk about how that sort of slots into virtual tabletops as we go in. So for this, for Inkarnate for this particular setting, I like the fantasy battle maps style. Some of what I've been doing recently has been in the watercolor map style that they have in Inkarnate, but there's some really cool like default things in the fantasy battle maps style, and so we're going to start there. This is one of those areas. If you're building your own map, this is a pretty important decision right off the rip. You have the resolution that you're editing in. You don't need to go Ultra 4K. You can export it later as that if you really want something that impressive. Like maybe you're going to put the visual up on a big screen and you want a nice crisp resolution. Definitely do that. But for editing, we're going to keep it right around 2K, which is more than enough for what we're trying to do. And I like this sort of landscape layout. A lot of the maps I do are square. I think it's more generally compatible and a little bit easier to slot in and plan for. But for this, I like landscape because of kind of some of the decisions I've already made in the back of my head. This is actually, as I load up the map here, this is the second time I've done this video. Halfway through my last cut, my daughter came home and rang our doorbell, and it like ruined the audio capture, and I had to stop and go take care of her. So there's actually a second map that you're going to get fully built out on investedinthecosmere.com, in addition to the one that we're building here you'll get a second map. So that's also very cool. So I'm going to talk a little bit about like half Incarnate specific things, and then half half general like map making philosophy while we're going through. So bear with me as we sort of transition between both. But right off the bat, what I like to do is use in Incarnate. This is a great tool. Is the grid tool, and I'm going to overlay a grid on top of our map. Generally in D&D and in the Cosmere RPG, I use a sort of assumed 5 by 5 foot square for each one of these grid spots. In Incarnate, you can do hex, you can do different layouts, you can do isometric. I like the sort of standard grid placement like this, and I like to consider each one of these blocks 5 feet square. And so depending on how big of an area of play I want for my players, I can kind of scale up or scale down my column count accordingly. So just to kind of put that plainly, this is a 4 by 3 grid. This would be 20 feet by 15 feet if we built that out in a map. Considering that each token, like each character or NPC, is going to take up one of these squares, you can kind of start to visualize what it would be like to move around this map. Take into consideration your player's move speed, especially for Radiants at higher levels, perhaps their flight speed. And that kind of gives you a sense for the type of map that you're going to need to match the situation. What I'm going for here with this Shadesmar map is going to be a river in the physical realm that we are traveling down to try to get to some other location within Shadesmar. So it's kind of like a choke point, if you will, encounter where maybe we're running into some fused or some spren who aren't particularly friendly. And so we have this sort of choke point that the party has to get through. So I chose that landscape layout, and I want this to be big. I want there to be a lot of flexibility mixing with the bead ocean and with the obsidian. And so I don't know exactly how many squares this is across. 24 by 18, do the math. We're going to talk about, kind of a large area. Maybe not that large, now that I think about it. We'll tone it down just a little bit. A little bit more than that. This is sort of like, this is the finicky part of getting your maps just right. And you'll see as we kind of go through this process, we're going to do really broad strokes and then go back into detailing later. It's a process. This video might be a little long in the tooth. It might be a little rambly for me. But this is kind of my process. I thought it would be fun and interesting to share. I actually saw somebody was on the subreddit asking for a Shadesmar battle map. And, you don't, if you want battle maps for your campaign, you don't need to go out and make them. Tons of people have them. There are plenty of battle maps from other games that are generic that'll work just fine. You can do a whiteboard and markers. You could do a plain piece of paper with pencil. You really can make any kind of battle map work. I like putting in the extra effort to make these style of battle maps for my campaign, and I was inspired by that Reddit post to make one for Shadesmar, because that is kind of a unique setting to the Cosmere, and there's going to be a lot of room for that. So again, an Incarnate thing. Incarnate works off of a sort of 3-tier texture sort of system where you have your background, or what would typically be considered a water layer, your foreground, a land layer, and then top, which goes over an overlay on top of everything. Right now it's a little hard to tell, but I'll just kind of sketch something out here. This is all background, so if you could imagine, this is all water, right? When we go to apply using our mask tool, we can kind of apply land in a shape, and you see it gives this kind of nice water effect, like it's a little island out in the ocean. For this, we are pathing out what is a river in the physical realm, and so it is obsidian in the cognitive realm, and as a result, the sort of where the land is in the physical realm, we're going to have the bead ocean. And so I'm going to kind of cut, sort of a river of land out for this battle map. So I really want to go for something that looks natural, but I also kind of want a choke point. So I want there to be some flexibility where the party can move around and have a combat encounter. I don't want it to quite be like one person in at any given time. Even this is pretty pretty tight, all things considered. You'd have one or two people square up here, and you're blocking the entire play area. I don't quite want that. Don't worry, by the way, about like the brown and the green. We're going to change that in just a minute. But I'm just kind of playing around with what feels right in the moment. It can kind of be zen at times when you're building these things, but again, I like it to be a little interesting, a little dynamic. So, I'm trying to picture what that river looks like in real life and trying to capture that, sort of natural ebb and flow while still allowing for a decent play area. So that's okay for now. We're probably going to come back and adjust this as we sort of continue to develop this out and begin to build the story of this area. But you'll see right away where tools like Incarnate with all these pre-generated graphics just are awesome for this type of setting, because they have an obsidian texture that actually looks great. It has that, like, I'm going to paint this in and then go back to the visual. It has that sort of like iridescence that obsidian has. There's another part, if I can go back on the copper mind here, when we look at this in the full image, you see that like iridescence to the obsidian that real natural obsidian has, and you kind of capture that within this. They've captured that well within this texture. And there are things in Incarnate you can do, like mess with the hue and everything like that, and the brightness level and the saturation to highlight that. And we'll do some cool stuff later with layering and the like to kind of mess around with that. But that's going to be my obsidian, and we'll do some texturing later to make that look even better. But I was having a hard time finding something that replicated the beads in sort of the depth that they have. There's some things you could do where, like, maybe we adjust the sort of scaling of this. These are roses. I could do scale to make them go down really small and make the color, turn the saturation down and make them more like, little balls, and that kind of actually looks pretty good. I might pair that up with some darker colors, not quite obsidian, but something darker to make it look cool. But another great thing about Incarnate is you can upload your own textures. And I went into Illustrator and just made some, I'm going to blow it up really big so you can kind of see what I did. I made some just like spheres. I made a sphere pattern. Again, this will be available on investedinthecosmere.com if you want to use it in Incarnate or in another sort of software you have. Feel free to do that. It took me like 2 seconds to make, so I'm happy to give it away to all of you. But that's obviously way too big. Like, if this is a 5-foot square, those would be some massive spheres. So I'm going to scale this down pretty significantly, paint this in. It looks really samey right now, like it's all the same pattern just repeated, which is not at all what this would look like in the actual Shadesmar. It'd be a lot more natural and flowing. And so we'll do some things to go in and fix that later. But for now, I really like that. It kind of gives you that sphere ocean and then obsidian. I can already kind of see, this world where you're battling some fused who are, sort of held up, blocking off this path. And, maybe your players are going to dive into the bead ocean and try to skirt around to do an ambush, or maybe they even try to sneak around them altogether. But again, we're we're going for this sort of look, and so there's a lot of fauna in Shadesmar. There are big trees. They all kind of have this black sort of ghost-like hue to it. There's also, bright colored crystals and everything like that, and some of it ties into the trees. So we're going to continue that with some stamps. Now, there is just a host of different stamps and the like within Incarnate that you can use by default. Here, I'm going to pull up, we were just using those, so we just had those trees, actually, which I really liked. Sort of a great pull right off the rip. I love this tree, but again, they're not quite green in Shadesmar. They're more of that muted tone. So we can come in and just kill that saturation. And that kind of gives us maybe a little bit more realistic to what we might expect. One really helpful thing with the grid here is that sense of scale and size. Like, when you're looking at what this tree looks like, this is, a 5-foot canopy, a little bit over, maybe like 7.5 feet diameter. That kind of matches what we're seeing in the photo. A little bit taller, a little bit skinnier trees. So some of these things are a little too big. We can kind of mess around with the scale to kind of get exactly what we need, but we can, add in some of those kind of dynamic tree landscapes and kind of break things up a little bit. This is top down. Your character tokens are going to go over it. So if you add a character token over this tree, you could, sort of imagine that they're in under that canopy. Maybe that gives them cover. Maybe that gives them advantage on a stealth roll if they're kind of sneaking around. You can kind of use the sort of the visuals we're building out in your storytelling in that scene. But I really liked those kind of like crystalline colors. So I'm going to mess with the hue and the saturation to kind of hit those oranges that we were seeing. Scale this up a little bit. And I'm going to kind of add some of that to the trees. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all those ones that I just placed and I'm going to move them down underneath the trees. And so you kind of get that, like, it's supposed to be crystals and whatnot, but it sort of gives you that effect a little bit. Maybe I want to get some more, like, completely different colors here. Let's get a little bit of maybe a pink. Could go with something more red. Change up the saturation. It's kind of hard with the size of the screen I have right now to see both at once. But you know what? That's okay. We can kind of continue to mess around with this as we go. And this process, like, of starting to build these things out, it's a lot of exploration. It's a lot of kind of like messing around and seeing what works, seeing what you like, trying new things out. Taking the stamps at face value, in my opinion, can kind of be boring. And so really messing around with, like, the different hues and opacities and, messing around with them that way can really bring some interesting results if you take the time to get it right. And, at the end of the day, it's whatever you want to do. It's almost like Bob Ross, painting little happy Shadesmar trees. Something else caught my eye. Obsidian is again, Incarnate specifically uses these tag structures. I'm gonna struggle to try to spell obsidian here without a cheat sheet. And so they have these really nice like rock outcroppings, and that's maybe a little too big. I used some of these in the other map that I made, but I kind of love the idea of building in some just physical height using these rocks. What was sort of an open kind of passageway now is a big obstacle. You kind of have to find your way around while you're trying to navigate this area. You really can change up the whole structure of a map just by adding in a couple of pieces like this. Even make it a little smaller, Now it's just kind of an outcropping that tree is faced on. So I don't I don't want to go too crazy here. It's really easy to make the maps like a little too busy and take away from really what most of your players are going to be doing, which is paying attention to the combat and the other characters on the page and what everybody's doing. You don't want to overcomplicate and have all of these crazy designs. Plus, once it gets down to sort of like battle map size, it can kind of get a little difficult to see anyway. So you kind of have to balance your artistic pursuits with that of what's practical for the game itself. But just to kind of give like a little bit of what I'll call like free texture, I'm just going to use this kind of like craggy rock overlay to just kind of mix up the obsidian a little bit and give it more of that sort of craggy effect. It's almost volcanic in a way that we see in the main photo. And this is feeling really good. Again, I'm going to kind of come back and using rotation, I'm going to try to break up some of the repetitiveness of this background with the spheres. I'm going to kill the grid just to make it a little bit clearer on what's being seen here. Again, this is an area where like this is just my attempt to make it look a little different, look a little better. Like my players probably aren't going to notice if it kind of has a pattern like this, at least not in any meaningful way. They may detect it, like they're not. They'll notice it's a pattern, but it's just kind of a fun way of sort of enhancing it a little bit, and it helps in the storytelling, it helps in the immersion. I don't think anyone would hold it against you if you had a bunch of repetitive patterns, and so don't go too crazy. I kind of mixed it up there, kind of gave it some texture pattern. I mean, it almost, I don't know, at least on this screen, it almost looks a little worse with the patterns like that because you can still see some of the interlocking. And in fact, I might just go back to, I might give it like a little bit of a rotation just to kind of break up its natural layer. And then rather than trying to make it go fully that way, I'm going to do a counter and then do an opacity. And that just kind of breaks up that pattern a little bit. And it's like a little bit harder to detect exactly what's going on there. And so I think that's good. It's a simple map, right? It's a couple of trees, some obsidian, but it feels like Shadesmar. Some Incarnate specific things, I can give it a map. Shadesmar, we'll call this river. I don't know if I spelt that right. Terrible at live spelling. But we'll save this. We're going to export it. We're going to export it in a couple of ways. We're going to do a gridless version, and then we're going to do a grid version. And just to show you the difference again, that's gridless, that's with the grid. I'll probably go on and throw a watermark on there for the website. But, that's basically it. Like that took, I don't know how long this video has been going on, but not too long. To throw together like a pretty usable battle map. It's interesting. It's, very specific. You kind of have to find a situation where you find yourself in Shadesmar in a river. But seeing how quickly something like this can come together, it just shows how you can take your campaign to 10 by putting in a little bit of effort, putting on, a map, and it's reusable. You can share it with friends. You can put it up on the subreddit. That's what I'm going to do later on today. You can do all of that and share your campaign materials with your friends. And it'll delight your players when you have a really cool battle map to fit the situation, especially when it's like a big epic moment that they've been building up to. It really does make all the difference. So give Incarnate a try. I believe there is a free version. I don't know if exactly what you get with the free version these days. The cost is very modest for the pro version. I do it because I've been using it for forever, and I love it. But there's free versions out there. There's also, like, you could just Google maps for tabletop RPGs, and you're going to find a ton of stuff. And if you want to find things specific to the Cosmere RPG, visit investedinthecosmere.com, subscribe to this YouTube channel, subscribe over there. I've got lots of really cool stuff coming up for the Cosmere RPG, both maps like this, tutorials, guides, resources, lots of really cool stuff. So check it out, stick around, and we'll catch you on the next one.